You'll never work another service job in this town again. I'll make sure of it, personally." That's what my manager screamed at me in front of a packed cafe 20 minutes before my father walked through that same door in his dress uniform and made her regret every single word of it. Tabik. My name is Mia Sinclair. I was 20 years old, a junior at Ashcroft University, and for 6 months I worked the counter at a little coffee shop called Brew & Co., mostly because I wanted to know what an ordinary life actually felt like. I should probably explain that part first because I know it sounds strange. My father is General Thomas Sinclair. 4 stars, 36 years of service, currently serving in a position senior enough that I'm not allowed to describe it in much detail even now. My mother passed away when I was 14, and my father, in the years after, became fiercely protective of me in a way I understood completely, even when it occasionally felt like too much. I grew up on bases all over the country, moving every couple of years, surrounded by people who either already knew exactly who my father was or found out within a week and adjusted how they treated me accordingly. I loved my childhood. I want to be clear about that. But I never once, growing up, got to find out what it felt like to be liked or disliked purely for being myself, with nothing else attached to it. I remember, around age 12, overhearing another officer's wife tell a friend that she made sure her daughter stayed close to me for the connections it might mean later. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation. I don't think I was even fully supposed to understand it at that age, but I understood enough to feel something shift permanently in how I looked at every friendship after that, wondering quietly which ones were actually about me. So when I started at Ashcroft, I made a decision my father wasn't thrilled about at first. I asked him to let me live like an ordinary student, modest apartment, a roommate who didn't know my last name meant anything, and, eventually, a part-time job I genuinely didn't need, just because I wanted the experience of earning my own small stack of tip money and complaining about a difficult shift like everybody else. He agreed eventually on one condition. He made me promise that if anything ever felt genuinely wrong, I'd call him immediately, no matter what. We actually had a long conversation about it, the summer before I started, sitting on the back porch of the house we'd finally settled into once his career had brought us somewhat closer to a normal, less mobile life. He told me he understood the impulse better than I probably realized, that he'd spent his own early career trying to prove himself entirely on his own merit, distancing himself from his own father's modest reputation as a small-town sheriff, wanting nothing handed to him. He said he'd learned, eventually, that there was a difference between refusing unearned advantages and refusing help entirely, and he hoped I'd learn that distinction faster than he had. I broke that promise for almost 6 months. I want to tell you why, because I think it matters. I didn't want my father to see me as someone who needed rescuing. Not after everything he'd already carried, losing my mother, raising me mostly alone around an unforgiving career. I wanted badly to handle this myself. Abic Brew & Co. was a small coffee shop 3 blocks from campus, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu that never quite got erased cleanly between specials. I loved it there, honestly, the first few weeks. I loved learning to pull a good espresso shot, loved the regulars who came in every morning needing exactly the same order, loved the specific, simple satisfaction of a job where the results of your effort were immediate and visible. The manager, a woman named Denise, decided within my first month that she didn't like me. I never fully understood why. Not at first. I think, looking back, my constant cheerfulness read to her as either fake or naive, and either interpretation apparently irritated her. Denise gave me the worst shifts almost immediately, closing on weeknights, opening on weekends after closing the night before. The kind of scheduling that would exhaust anyone regardless of how much they loved the job itself. When I made small mistakes, the kind every new employee makes, she corrected me loudly, in front of customers, in a tone she never used with anyone else on staff. I remember one specific morning, maybe 3 weeks in, when I accidentally used whole milk instead of oat milk in a customer's drink. A genuinely easy mistake during a rush, one every barista makes at some point. Denise stopped what she was doing, walked over, and announced loudly enough for the whole line to hear, "This is exactly why I said hiring a college girl who's never worked a real job before was a mistake." The customer looked uncomfortable on my behalf. I just apologized quietly and remade the drink, the way I learned to do with almost everything that whole first month. There was a coworker, Chelsea, who'd worked there almost 2 years by the time I started, and who seemed to take an instant dislike to me as well, though hers had a clearer motive behind it. Chelsea had been next in line for a shift supervisor promotion before I arrived. Denise, for reasons I never fully understood, started giving me small extra responsibilities almost immediately, which Chelsea read, correctly or not, as a threat to that promotion. Chelsea handled that threat by making my shifts as miserable as she could manage. She'd accidentally mess up drink orders I'd already prepared correctly, then loudly blame me in front of customers. She'd take unscheduled extra long breaks during my busiest hours, leaving me to handle a full counter alone. There was one Saturday morning, our busiest shift of the week, when Chelsea disappeared for nearly 45 minutes claiming a family emergency phone call, leaving me to run the entire counter alone during a line that stretched out the door. When Denise finally noticed the backup, Chelsea reappeared just in time to loudly comment in front of Denise that I really should learn to work faster instead of falling behind like this. I didn't say anything about the 45 minutes. I'd already learned by then that pointing out Chelsea's actual behavior never seemed to land the way pointing out mine did. The worst part, though, wasn't Denise or Chelsea. It was my own classmates. Ashcroft's campus was close enough that plenty of students came through Brew & Co. regularly, and within a month or so, word had apparently spread that Mia from Intro to Statistics worked the counter there. A specific clique led by a girl named Brittany Colfax started coming in almost every week, seemingly for the sole purpose of ordering me around rudely, mocking my apron, and generally treating the whole visit like a form of entertainment at my expense. Brittany once ordered an elaborate customized drink, waited until I'd made it exactly to her specifications, and then loudly declared it wrong in front of her friends, demanding I remake it, clearly just to watch me do the extra work. Another time, one of her friends accidentally knocked over a full drink onto the counter, laughed about it, and then complained to Denise that I'd been careless, resulting in another public scolding. Brittany seemed to particularly enjoy bringing up my job in front of other classmates outside the cafe too, in the middle of our shared statistics lecture more than once, asking loudly whether I'd made anyone's latte today in a tone clearly meant to be diminishing rather than curious. A few classmates laughed along, the way people sometimes do, simply to avoid becoming the next target themselves. I stopped raising my hand in that class as often as I used to. Not because I didn't know the material, but because I didn't want to give her another opening. I want to explain something about why I never fought back harder during any of this. Part of it was the promise to my father and my stubborn insistence on solving it myself. But part of it, honestly, was something simpler. I still love that job, most days, despite all of it. I loved the actual work. I didn't want to let a handful of cruel people take that away from me entirely. There was one person, though, who made those 6 months genuinely bearable. And I want to tell you about him because he matters enormously to how the story ends. Check. His name was Ethan. He was a regular, came in most mornings around 7:30 for a plain black coffee before his early shift at a hardware store across town. Always polite, always exactly the same easy, unremarkable order. I noticed him mostly because he was one of the only customers who ever asked how my actual day was going and seemed to genuinely want an answer. Ethan was a year older than me, not enrolled at Ashcroft himself, working full-time at the hardware store while taking night classes toward an associate's degree in a different program across town. He mentioned once, early on, that he liked coming into Brew & Co. specifically because it was the one part of his morning that felt unhurried, before a full day of physical work and a night class stacked on top of it. Looking back, I think part of why we understood each other so easily was that neither of us fit neatly into Ashcroft's usual social categories. Me hiding an identity most people would have reacted to differently, him simply existing slightly outside a campus-centered social world that never fully included people working full-time instead of attending classes there. The first time he witnessed Brittany's clique in action, about 2 months into my job there, he didn't say anything in the moment. I don't think he wanted to make things worse for me by escalating a scene, but he waited until they'd left and told me, quietly, that what he'd just watched wasn't okay and that I didn't deserve to be spoken to that way over a coffee order. After that, he started noticing patterns. He started timing his visits without ever quite admitting it out loud, around my worst shifts, the ones with Denise or Chelsea both scheduled, and more than once, when things got bad enough, he stepped in directly. There was a specific morning, about 4 months in, when Denise screamed at me in front of a full cafe for a mistake that genuinely wasn't mine. Chelsea had mislabeled an order, and Denise assumed, without asking, that the mistake was mine. Ethan, standing in line, said, calmly but clearly, that he'd watched Chelsea make that exact order himself, and that Denise might want to actually check the security footage before continuing to yell at someone in front of a room full of paying customers. Denise didn't appreciate that. She told him sharply that it wasn't his business. He said, just as calmly, that he'd been coming in 5 mornings a week for months, and he'd watched enough of this pattern to consider it exactly his business, as a customer who cared whether the staff serving him were being treated decently. I remember standing behind that counter, humiliated and grateful in equal measure, watching a man I barely knew defend me more forcefully than I'd ever quite managed to defend myself. Over those months, Ethan and I built something slow and quiet, mostly conversations across a counter, the occasional extended chat during a slow stretch, nothing either of us ever named directly. I looked forward to 7:30 most mornings in a way that had very little to do with coffee. I never told him who my father was. Not because I didn't trust him, but because, honestly, I'd started to genuinely enjoy being just Mia to him, the same way I'd wanted to be just Mia to everyone else at that job. I liked that his kindness toward me had never once been calculated around anything I could offer him. I understood, somewhere quietly in the back of my mind, that telling him the truth might change that, even if I didn't want it to. See, the worst day happened on a Thursday afternoon, about 6 months into the job during what should have been an ordinary closing shift. Brittany's click came in about 20 minutes before close, louder and more emboldened than usual, apparently having pre-gamed the visit with a few drinks at a nearby bar. One of her friends, a young man I didn't recognize, accidentally knocked an entire tip jar off the counter, scattering coins and a few folded bills across the floor. Brittany laughed loudly and made a comment about how it probably wouldn't even make a dent in what little I was earning anyway. Ugh. I bent down to start collecting the mess without saying anything, mostly just wanting the whole encounter to end. That's when Denise walked out from the back office, took one look at the scattered tip jar, and, without asking a single question, accused me of having staged the mess to steal from it. I want you to understand how absurd that accusation actually was. But Denise had apparently decided in the 2 seconds it took her to walk out from the back that this was her opportunity to finally get rid of me. I've had complaints about you for months, she said loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear. Customers uncomfortable with your attitude. Missing inventory I can't fully account for. And now I catch you with your hand in the tip jar during closing, conveniently right when a group of customers happens to be walking out the door as a distraction. I stood there for a moment, genuinely stunned by how completely fabricated the whole narrative was. Months of manufactured grievances I'd never once heard about until she needed them to justify this exact moment. A woman near the register, a stranger I didn't recognize, actually spoke up on her own, saying she'd seen the whole thing and it had clearly been an accident. Denise ignored her entirely. I told her, as calmly as I could manage through the shock of it, that I hadn't touched the tip jar, that her own customer had knocked it over accidentally, and that there were at least 6 witnesses standing right there who could confirm it. Denise wasn't interested in witnesses. You're fired, she said, effective immediately, and I'll be documenting this properly, which means you'll never work another service job in this town again. I'll make sure of it personally. Brittany and her friends, to their credit or lack of it, said absolutely nothing to correct the record, clearly finding the whole unfolding scene entertaining rather than alarming. I stood there, humiliated in front of a room of strangers and a manager who'd apparently been building a fictional case against me for months, and felt something in me finally, completely break. Ethan, who happened to be there for a rare evening visit, stepped forward immediately. That's not what happened, he said. I saw the whole thing. Her friend knocked the jar over. Mia didn't touch a single coin. Denise turned on him next. This doesn't concern you. I'd like you to leave my cafe. I'm a paying customer watching you fabricate a theft accusation against an employee in front of witnesses, Ethan said, his voice steady but noticeably harder than I'd ever heard it. That concerns me plenty. Ugh. Denise threatened to call the police on both of us if we didn't leave immediately. I want to be honest and tell you that in that exact moment, humiliated, exhausted, watching a job I genuinely loved collapse into a false accusation I had no way of disproving to a woman who'd already decided the outcome, I finally broke my promise to my father. I stepped outside, hands shaking, and called him. I remember standing in that parking lot, coins from the overturned tip jar still visible through the front window, trying to steady my voice enough to dial correctly. My hands were shaking badly enough that I misdialed twice before the call actually connected. I don't think I'd felt that specific combination of humiliated and powerless since I was a child, watching adults make decisions about my life that I had no say in whatsoever. Akip. He picked up on the second ring. I don't think I'd ever cried on the phone with him quite like that before, not since my mother's funeral. I told him everything, all of it, 6 months of it, in about 4 minutes, faster than I'd ever spoken in my life. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said in the same calm, level voice I remembered from childhood nightmares he'd talked me down from, I'm 20 minutes away for a veterans outreach event downtown. I'm coming now. I told him he didn't have to. He said simply, Mia, you called. That's exactly what the promise was for. I'm coming. I. He arrived 19 minutes later. I remember the specific sound of the cafe going quiet when the door opened. A four-star general in his dress uniform stepping through it with the kind of unmistakable command presence that doesn't require a single raised word to fill a room. He'd clearly come straight from the Veterans Outreach event. Still in the uniform he must have been wearing for photographs and handshakes 20 minutes earlier. His expression calm in the specific way I recognized from childhood as the calm right before he handled something extremely seriously. He scanned the room once, found me standing near the counter, and crossed to me first, resting one hand briefly on my shoulder before turning to address the room. Huh! Denise, to her credit, had no idea who he was at first. She started to explain in the same confident tone she'd used on me that there had been a theft incident and that she was handling it appropriately. My father listened silently for almost a full minute, letting her dig the hole considerably deeper before he said a single word. I understand you've accused my daughter of theft, he finally said. Based on an incident several witnesses in this room can apparently confirm was an accident caused by someone else's customer. Denise's face changed the moment he said my daughter. I watched her run through, in real time, the exact same rapid recalculation I'd seen happen to other people in other rooms at other moments just like this one, over the years. You're General Sinclair's daughter, she said, her voice noticeably smaller than it had been 30 seconds earlier. I am, I told her. I have been the entire 6 months I've worked here. It never seemed relevant to mention until you decided to fabricate a theft accusation against me in front of a room full of people. My father asked calmly for the names of every witness present and wrote them down himself, along with a brief note about exactly what Denise had said. He then asked to see the cafe's corporate contact information, mentioning, almost as an aside, that he happened to sit on the advisory board of a small business lending program that had, according to the paperwork he'd reviewed years earlier while vetting community investment initiatives, financed this specific franchise's original expansion loan. Denise went visibly pale. My father wasn't threatening her with anything dramatic. He didn't need to. He simply made it extremely clear that the corporate office was about to receive a very detailed, very well-documented complaint from someone whose name they were unlikely to dismiss easily. He called the regional franchise director directly from the cafe parking lot while Denise stood inside watching through the window with an expression I genuinely felt a little sorry for, underneath everything else I was feeling. I found out later that call resulted in a full investigation within 24 hours, security footage reviewed, 6 independent witness statements collected, Chelsea's months of quiet sabotage finally surfacing under actual scrutiny for the first time. The regional director, a woman named Carla Jimenez, drove out personally the following morning once she understood the scope of what the footage actually showed. She apologized to me directly, at length, and told me the company had a zero-tolerance policy for exactly this kind of unfounded accusation, one that apparently existed on paper long before I'd ever worked there, but had never been meaningfully enforced at this particular location. She offered me my job back immediately, along with back pay for the shift I'd been wrongfully sent home from. Denise was terminated within the week, both for the fabricated accusation and for what the investigation revealed was a documented pattern of favoritism and mistreatment stretching back well before I'd ever started working there. Chelsea was let go shortly after, once the footage clearly showed her deliberately mislabeling orders and taking unauthorized extended breaks during my shifts for months. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Chelsea eventually did get the shift supervisor promotion she'd wanted so badly at a completely different coffee chain across town. Once enough time had passed that her old employment history stopped following her around every interview. I don't know whether she ever connected the dots about why her original promotion attempt collapsed so thoroughly, or whether she still tells some version of the story where she was simply unlucky rather than the one who'd spent months deliberately sabotaging a coworker. I've decided I don't need to know. Some people's growth happens quietly, off camera, long after the people they hurt have already moved on. Brittany's clique faced a different kind of reckoning. One of her friends had, unfortunately for them, filmed several of their visits over the months, intending them as entertainment for a group chat. Those videos, once people understood exactly whose daughter they'd been mocking, found their way to the university's student conduct office through channels I never fully asked about. I don't know all the details of what happened to Brittany academically. I know she stopped attending Brew & Co. entirely, and I heard secondhand that her particular social circle grew noticeably smaller that following semester. I want to be honest and tell you I didn't take much satisfaction in that part. I'd wanted for 6 months simply to be treated decently. Watching consequences finally land didn't erase the months that came before it. It just meant they stopped landing on anyone else after me. I ran into Brittany once more, actually, near the end of that semester in a campus bookstore of all places. She saw me first, and I watched her consider for a long moment whether to say anything at all before quietly approaching. She apologized, briefly and a little awkwardly, admitting she hadn't fully understood at the time how much of what felt like harmless fun to her and her friends had actually cost me. I told her I appreciated her saying so, though I also told her that the apology would have meant more coming before a general had to walk into a cafe to force the issue. She didn't argue with that. She just nodded, and we went our separate ways, and I never saw her at Brew & Co. again. My father stayed at the cafe for almost an hour that evening, mostly just sitting with me at a corner table while the last of the chaos settled, letting me finally cry properly, the way I hadn't let myself in front of Denise or Brittany or anyone else that whole difficult stretch. He asked gently why I hadn't called him sooner. I told him the truth, that I hadn't wanted him to see me as someone who needed rescuing, especially after everything he'd already carried alone since my mother passed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've held on to since. Mia, needing help occasionally isn't the same as being unable to handle your own life. I've commanded soldiers for 3 decades. The best ones were never the ones who refused backup out of pride. They were the ones smart enough to call for it exactly when it actually mattered. I believed him. I still do. He also told me a little later that evening that he'd known more about my 6 months at Brew & Co. than I'd realized. Not the specifics, not the daily cruelties, but enough general awareness that something had been weighing on me, gathered from the slightly shorter phone calls, the specific tiredness in my voice during our weekly check-ins. He said he'd made a decision months earlier to trust me to handle it on my own unless I asked for help, even though every instinct he had wanted to intervene sooner. I asked why. He said, "Because you asked me to let you live an ordinary life, and ordinary lives include figuring out some things on your own first. I just needed you to know the door was always open the moment you needed it." I asked him a little later whether he'd ever regretted encouraging that specific kind of independence in me, given everything that had happened. He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," he said finally. "I regret that it took this long and that it cost you this much before you called. But I don't regret raising a daughter who tries to handle her own battles first. I'd regret the version of you who never tried at all a great deal more." Ethan came by my apartment 2 days later, a little nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him before. He admitted, honestly, that finding out my father was a 4-star general had genuinely rattled him, that some part of him worried the gap between our lives was suddenly much larger than he'd let himself think about over the past 6 months. He told me he'd spent the whole drive over rehearsing what he wanted to say, something about not wanting to seem like he was only interested now because of who my father turned out to be, or worse, worried I might think that's what it was about. I told him I'd never once thought that, watching him defend me at a counter for months before either of us had any idea my father was going to show up in uniform. If anything, I told him, that timing was the clearest possible proof it had never been about anything except who I actually was to him, long before there was a general attached to the story at all. I told him the gap had always technically been there. It just hadn't mattered to either of us until he found out about it. which told me something important about which parts of him were actually paying attention to me this whole time, and which parts were just now catching up to a fact that had never once changed who I actually was. He asked if my father, having now met him under such chaotic circumstances, was going to have opinions about who I spent time with going forward. I laughed for the first time in days and told him my father had actually mentioned him specifically on the drive back to base that evening. He'd said plainly that any man willing to stand up to an angry manager and a room full of entitled college students on behalf of someone he had no obligation to defend was exactly the kind of character he'd want around his daughter, General's daughter or not. Ethan seemed to relax considerably after hearing that. We're still together now, a year later, and my father, to Ethan's occasional bemusement, has become something close to genuinely fond of him, in the specific, gruff, understated way my father shows fondness for anyone. I went back to Brew& Co. about 2 weeks after everything happened, once new management had been brought in. The new manager, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Pauline, had already heard the full story by the time I walked in and told me, plainly, that she built an entirely different set of expectations for how staff treated each other going forward. Pauline had transferred in from a location 2 towns over, specifically to reset the culture at that particular Brew& Co. after everything came to light. She told me during that first conversation that she'd already implemented a clear policy requiring any customer complaint against staff to include a specific documented incident rather than vague general impressions. Precisely the kind of change that would have made Denise's fabricated case considerably harder to build in the first place. I appreciated that she seemed genuinely focused on the systemic problem, not just smoothing things over for appearances. I didn't take my old job back, in the end. Some things, once broken, are easier to build fresh somewhere else than to fully repair in the same place. But I did keep going in as a regular customer, most mornings, usually right around 7:30. I think about that whole 6 months often and what it actually taught me. Not that hiding who you are is always the right call, because I'm honestly still not sure it was. Some days. But I learned exactly what kind of person shows up for someone with absolutely nothing to gain from it. And I learned that my father was right all those years ago about needing to actually call for backup instead of carrying everything myself out of pure stubborn pride. I think, too, about how differently that whole 6 months might have gone if I'd simply told people who my father was from the very first week. It probably would have been easier in the narrow sense of avoiding all that mistreatment entirely. But I don't think I'd have learned nearly as much about who Ethan actually was, or about my own capacity to keep showing up cheerfully to a job that kept trying to grind that cheerfulness out of me. Some lessons only teach you anything if you're willing to sit through the hard part first. If you've ever been quietly mistreated by people who assumed you had no way of fighting back, I hope you find your own version of the phone call I finally made that Thursday evening. Whether that's a parent, a friend, or simply your own resolve finally outweighing your pride, I hope it comes to you sooner than it came to me. I don't think everyone has a 4-star general to call, and I want to be careful not to suggest that's actually the lesson here. The lesson, I think, is smaller and more available to almost anyone. It's simply this: pride that keeps you silent while you're being genuinely mistreated isn't actually strength, no matter how much it might feel like it in the moment. Strength was always going to be the phone call itself, whoever ends up on the other end of it. And if you're the person standing at that counter watching someone else get mistreated the way Ethan did morning after morning, until it finally mattered, I hope you say something too. It costs you very little. It can mean everything to the person on the other side of that counter. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a job, a classroom, or any room where someone underestimated exactly who they were dealing with, I'd love to hear about it. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.